actually can't see anybody, and I feel like that might make it easier. Can everybody hear me? Is that okay? All right, so I'm going to start out today talking about segregation in education, mostly public education, and the military during World War II. So one of the things I'm not going to really get into too much is the individual military units. Probably won't hear me say Tuskegee or anything like that. It's more about the systems that they were operating under. So if you want more information about that, we have it on our website and in other places. I have business cards, so you can come and I'll email you whatever other information you're looking for if you want that. So when I started thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, you know, I knew I had the topic, but I wasn't really sure the best way to go about it. And then I was, you know, thinking about what this day is. And today is actually the 49th anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X. And that felt like something that was very important to acknowledge, especially as I was reading an article the other day. And a school that is actually where I grew up in Flushing, Queens, had banned children from writing about him for their report for Black History Month. And the school board and thankfully a number of other people and parents stepped in, and those students were allowed to write about whoever they wanted to write about. But it felt really necessary to mention that because these kinds of things are still happening today. That kind of erasure of history, this sort of de-radicalization of what ended up being a very violent and difficult time in our American history. So he would have been 88 now, and sometime, you know, a lot of what this talk gets at is the loss of potential, how you treat people and the way they're presented information impacts what they are able to achieve. In his case, he was shot dead, and that's a little bit different, but when you tell children, even at the youngest ages, what they're capable of doing and that it's, you know, not great, think about all that loss of potential inventions and intellect and all the other things that people get when they get a proper education. Something that I think some of the teachers in the audience will probably appreciate, one of the difficulties I found in my own teaching, and especially at the museum, is students consider World War II and the Civil Rights Movement very different in their minds. They're very different parts of history, completely different eras, different people. They're taught in a segmented way often, and so I just remember telling a group of students that I worked with at another museum that Anne Frank and Martin Luther King Jr. were born in the same year, and they didn't understand how that was possible because they existed in different times. But telling them like they didn't, they were there to, you know, at the same time is something that's really kind of fun to watch them process. So the Civil Rights Movement is typically defined as starting in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education, ruling that separate is inherently unequal. But World War II has a lot to do with how 1954 came to be. All of these things in the United States are happening at the same time. You've got the war going on, but you've also got people who are angry about how they're being treated by their government, by their education systems, by society. You know, one of the interesting things that came out of World War II is when they were trying to recruit for the military and they were trying to recruit for skilled labor and things like that, they found that in Black and Latino communities, they weren't adequately educated to serve. And so it wasn't until it negatively impacted themselves that a lot of the government officials were like, we have to do something about this. This isn't the way we should be running things. So it's a little bittersweet. It took the need for this kind of labor and for military personnel for that to really come to the forefront for a lot of people. So a child cannot be taught by anyone who despises him. James Baldwin, and that's kind of the crux of the separate but equal in the education system. So you have children who are taken from their neighborhoods when they're comfortable and forced to go to a different school if they're integrated, or you know, they're separated and they don't even know what the other kids are like. They don't even know what the other schools are like. And you know, bringing it back to Malcolm X, he was a product of this school system. He was a product of a school system that deliberately denies Black children learning opportunities, basically telling him he was less than. And you know, he drops out of school at 13, which is, you know, we think about that today, and a lot of people finish school early, but dropping out at 13 is it's sad. And so the catalyst for him dropping out was actually when his white teacher told him, when he said, I want to be a lawyer. You know, she asked, what does everybody want to be when they grow up? And she told him that was no realistic goal for an N-word. And he never came back to school. And, you know, he probably would have been a pretty phenomenal lawyer. But that's probably for another day in another museum. So I'm going to pull up right now some images from a website that we just launched called World War II Yearbooks. See you next year. A lot of these yearbooks deal with the home, well, they all deal with the home front. They all deal with issues of the war. This one in particular, and you'll recognize Topeka from the Brown v. Board of Ed decision, this is 10 years before that. So Topeka High School was actually integrated since its opening in 1871. But in Topeka, only the elementary schools were actually segregated. So that's where that court case comes from. It's the elementary schools. Anything under high school was allowed to be segregated, but the high school was integrated. So excuse me. So the Topeka High School is integrated, but all of the clubs, school dances, any extracurriculars, all of those things were designated segregated, and they would remain so until 1949. So we can kind of go through this yearbook, and you can even see in the portraits, you know, everybody's different. There's black, there's white, but then we get here. So we get to our prom king and queen, and we have you know, King Bill, Queen Mary, and then we turn the page and we get to our black king and queen. And so because all of the activities are segregated, that also applied to anything like a school dance, a prom court, a homecoming court. So King Lloyd and Queen Barbara, you'll notice they're sharing a page, first of all. What else do we notice? Their last names aren't in the title. And what do you think that does to a person? Like they don't even get their last name. It's dehumanizing. It's a way of saying, you know, you get this, but you're still less than. And it's a very subtle reminder. It's not outwardly obvious that these are segregated even. You know, you have to look and really realize, wait, why do they have two? Why are there two separate prom kings and queens? And that's something also, you know, for the teachers, that's something really great for them to see. You know, it's obviously not great because that it happened, but it's a really great way to look at primary sources in a different way. It's not obvious. And as we go through, you know, we see the normal things that are in a World War II yearbook: died in service, missing in action. And it's interesting, though. Some of these clubs do have black students and white students. So you have, in that top right photo. But then we get to the sports, and we get to the white basketball team and the black basketball team. But everything. So, and this is unique to Topeka, Kansas, but it's also replicated in a lot of school systems across the country. But this is the example that we have. So when you look really closely at some of the text, you see that the black basketball team played fewer games. They have less space in the yearbook. It's very clear. You know, it makes a lot more sense where that separate is unequal comes from 10 years later. It really bridges that gap that we see. All right, and then we've got some more. All right, so this is the owl, and this is, sorry, there's some vocabulary and other things, but this is Westminster High School in Maryland. All right. And again, it's all pretty normal, looks pretty standard, looks a lot like your yearbook probably did, looks a lot like mine did. And then we get to some of the extracurriculars. We got the French club, basketball. Notice we haven't really, I mean, if you're not looking too closely, but we haven't seen any black children. Okay, and then we get to the Minstrel Show. So what do you do if you don't have black children and you want to put on a show? Yeah, so this is something that, you know, this is the only yearbook that have this instance of, but it's something that I've seen in a lot of my research. This was a pretty common practice. And if you look at this photo closely, you can't even zoom in enough to see that whole front row, other than the center, is students in blackface. I mean, they're so dark that they're actually blending into all of the clothes, which is, yeah. And then we've got one more. This is from Rockford, Illinois. This is West High School. And this one's got a lot with a lot of military, but then you see here, this one's actually a little ahead of the other ones. So this teacher, uphold race equality and unselfishness, also predicts that the war will end in 1945, which I found a little creepy. All right, so Miss Worley, after considerable thought, states that she thinks the European War will end in 1945 and the Pacific War in 46. Miss Ray feels that to maintain permanent peace, the feelings of super race and white superiority must be eradicated. This shouldn't be as radical of a statement as it is, but when I found it, I got really excited because I just looked at the Kansas one for a really long time and was getting kind of depressed. And segregation in the schools is a lot more complex than it actually is in the military. In the military, there's some kind of blurred lines about who goes where, but ultimately it was very clear where you belonged based on the color of your skin. In the schools, it's a lot more complicated. So it gets even more complex when you're dealing with students who did not identify as white but also are not black. So many Latino and Asian Pacific American students, they didn't go to the white schools, they didn't go to the black schools, they didn't really fit in either one. And there's actually a Supreme Court case, Mendez versus Westminster, in 1947, where a Latino student, Sylvia Mendez, challenged the fact that she could not go to the white school that was right by her house. They were sending her to a Hispanic school that was really far away from her house. And it actually proved to be an important precedent to Brown versus Board of Education. So she gets this separate is unequal ruling. She's allowed to go to the white school. She's treated horribly at this white school. She had to actually, in court, during the case, testify that she knew English, because one of the reasons for trying to keep them out of school was that, well, they can't speak the language. How am I supposed to teach them? And she gets up there and she speaks perfectly fluent English because she grew up in the United States and it was her first language. And these are the kinds of things that are repeated over and over up until we get to the 1954 Brown decision. That doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's a long, long time and many different battles before they can get to that Topeka integration ruling. And I'm trying to focus more on the black experience, but ultimately it all kind of goes hand in hand. So the way that Sylvia Mendez was able to fight to get to the school that she knew she deserved to go to, it 100% impacted the Brown decision and the way that that came about. All right, so segregation in the military, that's a little more straightforward, but also, when you're on the battlefield, are you really thinking about black versus white? And so there's a lot of instances where soldiers found themselves alongside people of different colors. When the United States goes to war in December 1941, the military remained completely segregated, and even the most basic events like church, transporting soldiers in train cars, all of these just little daily things were kept racially separate. So by 1945, more than 1.2 million African Americans had served in uniform, despite the fact that initially the all-white draft boards would frequently reject African Americans when they would say, sign, hey, I'm here. And they would get rejected. Not to talk about Malcolm X again, but he actually went to the draft board and was rejected because he was deemed racist against white people, and he left, which, probably his goal. Okay, so they are separate, and then continual pressure from the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, resulted in the War Department's 1941 creation of the all-black 99th Pursuit Squadron, which we know today as the Tuskegee Airmen. NAACP is one of the most important organizations in fighting for that were fighting for equality during World War II, and it was never actually achieved. But their work had convinced President Roosevelt to sign a pledge that African Americans would be enlisted in accordance with their percentage in the population, which was 10.6%. Again, that was never actually achieved, but it was a big milestone for the NAACP in even getting Roosevelt to agree that far. The experience for a black and white soldier is also very different. So black soldiers are routinely relegated to service units. They're supervised by white officers. They're performing menial labor at a much higher rate than white counterparts. They're working in kitchens, they're cleaning, handling cargo, doing laundry. So now I'm going to bring up, this is from the museum's recently launched digital collections. I feel like I see Lisa back there. Lisa's amazing. Is Lindsay there too? I can't see anybody. There she is. Okay, so Lindsay's our senior archivist. Lisa's an archivist here at the museum, and they recently launched our first iteration of their digital collections. So you can go on here, and there's 150 oral histories, thousands of photographs. And so this is Wallace Baptiste, so I'm going to let him talk for a little while.
Of course, being in the Navy at that time that was still segregated, I mean, what are your feelings looking back on that? Do you think you were mistreated in any major way? Or?
Well, you know, I tell you what, I figured there was so much talent we lost by treating us, you know, in a way. But you know what? If I had to do it, I'd do it all over again. And then the service to the country. And at that time, I thought we lost a lot by segregating us, you know. You know, I used to talk with some of the officers sometimes, and I said, well, you know, if I can only go back to supply school, I used to see the men come through, and they send them back to Harvard, and they go to Yale, and West Point, and, you know, the Naval Academy. You know, a lot of.
So his oral history is really fascinating. If you ever want to spend an hour just hearing him talk, it's really compelling. He goes on to talk a lot about the opportunities that education could afford. He mentions Harry Belafonte and Bill Cosby. He's a really fascinating person. And so one of the things that he really drives home is that idea of the lost potential, that he felt like he personally could have done more than he was allowed to do. So by 1945, troop losses actually forced the military to place more African American troops into positions of infantrymen, pilots, tankers, medics, and officers in record-setting numbers. So that was one good, you know, you don't want anything good to ever come out of a loss of life, but there was at least this opportunity for a lot of African American men and women to do things that they hadn't previously been allowed to do in the war. One of the biggest issues in the segregated military is that interactions between white and black military personnel, when they're not, you know, abroad, could become violent. It's very difficult to try to serve alongside someone who believes you to be less than they are. So this is Joseph Hairston, and he talks about, well, I'll let him talk again, but he's talking about a shooting that he witnesses and the aftermath of that shooting.
During all of our training, your archery officers wear a pistol. You wore your gun all the time. It became almost like putting on your shoes. You weren't even aware you had it. So when I get to Alexandria, I'm wearing my pistol. They had never seen a soldier in town with a weapon. As I'm walking down the street, suddenly everybody is moving away, and I wonder, why are they looking at me so funny? And I suddenly become aware I'm armed. Now, it was nothing unusual to me, but it was a strange thing for the people in town. It was rather interesting, the reaction of civilians seeing a black soldier with guns. Now, I have to back up a little bit and tell you another story. before I went to OCS, I was stationed in Alexandria, Louisiana, which is very near the Maneuver area and where my wife lived. And the black part of town, Lee Street, had what was the center part of the black area was one long block, about the equivalent of 2 city blocks long, with nothing across in between. And it was just shoulder to shoulder with juke joints, beer joints, all that sort of stuff. And on this particular day, a couple of soldiers were drunk, and the black MPs picked them up to take them into custody. And as they were taking these 2 black drunk soldiers out legitimately, a couple of white MPs came along and took control from the black MPs. Well, now, they're in the street like maggots, and it didn't bother them that the black MPs had taken a couple of drunks, but when they see the white MPs, why are they here? So they beat the hell out of the white MPs and chased the white MPs out. The white MPs went back, got reinforcements, more white MPs. But now the crowd is jubilant. They beat the hell out of the more MPs, and they leave. Now remember I said it's a very long block, the cross streets at either end. And I was right, I saw this happening at the beginning, but the good Lord takes care of fools in Joe Harrison. And for some reason or other, I had moved away from the center and was at the cross street at the beginning of this very long block. I was standing right at the corner. Now, coming down the block now were the white MPs again, with civilian policemen with shotguns. And as they get to the corner where I just happen to be standing there, one white policeman pushed me in the chest. He said, "Get out of my way, nigga." He pushed me out, and at that time they opened fire point blank into the soldiers. We don't know how many were killed. You won't find a report, that at least I couldn't find any report as to how many were killed. When I heard the gunshot, I got off the street. I went to the movie. That's peanut heaven. You go to the White Moon, you go upstairs. But I figured if they're shooting around, you want to be out of sight. So when I come out of the movie, now the MPs immediately got me on a bus and sent me back to the post. We were quarantined for 30 days. We couldn't go to town. But you'll never find a report of that incident. At least, let's put it this way, I can't find a report. I know that we're back to B.O. Davis Jr. His father was a brigadier general. His father was sent to do the investigation. I've never seen the report. I've gone to the archives. I can't find anything.
Okay, that's also, if you have some time to watch that, you know, his oral, it's equal parts. You know, he has a very good sense of humor, but there's also a lot of heartbreak there. And it's really, I feel like his is a very good representation of what it was like for that kind of, you know, to be an African American in the military during World War II. And you know, his story also reminds me, you know, I had talked about this in my last lecture a couple of years ago, but there were African Americans who were stationed in the South who couldn't actually eat at the same kinds of restaurants where German prisoners were eating. So there were German prisoners who were able to go out and get a pass to go places, and then the actual, you know, American citizens weren't allowed in those places either. Okay. Okay, so the most subtle effect of oppression is what it does to your mind, what it does to the way you think of yourself. This, to me, rang true for both education and the military. So the ways in which black soldiers and black students are spoken to, the jobs that they're given, the tasks that they're given, even the difference in the homework that black students were given, all play into this idea that they're not good enough. And when you're told that over and over, you tend to start to believe it. And that's kind of how white supremacy works in general. That's how oppressive regimes work in general. You're told over and over something about yourself that's negative, and a lot of people, you end up starting to believe it. So when we talk about segregation, I think the first thing that pops to mind, especially for a lot of kids who are studying in school for the first time, is the separate water fountains, separate entrances, the lunch counters. And these are all really important images, but it's not because, nobody was risking their life, nobody was being murdered over a water fountain. It was what the water fountain represented. It's about exhibiting power over somebody else. And reinforcing that power. So to have to constantly use separate and often inferior services is this continual and often subtle daily reminder to black people, but especially to black children who are trying to grow up in this world, that they're not considered valuable members of society, that they're not going to grow up to be valued members of society. You can't sit there, you can't go to school there, you can't be a lawyer. All of these things are kind of coming to a head, and by 1954, that's when it's really, that's when we start to see this transition, but it's on its way for a very long time before that. Okay, so the desegregation of the military, that officially happens in 1948. But there's instances where it's a little more complicated than that. So this is an oral history with, okay. All right, William Hallman III. So I'm going to play this for you.
When we got overseas, and in Italy, black and white, we were all brothers. We all were a team. We relied on one another. And those guys forgot about their racist attitudes. And when the war ended, and we came back to the States, the most amazing thing, I remember this for the rest of my life. We were coming down the gangplank, getting off the boat. Now there were more blacks on the boat coming back because they brought our group back together. And they had a sign at the bottom of the gangplank. White to one side, colored to the other side. And I said to myself, this is some country. I'm fighting for democracy. And this is the first time that I even thought about fighting for recognition as a first-class citizen in my own country. I was fighting for the democracy, and I had to fight for the right to fight. I thought America was a sick country. One of the things, when the war ended.
Okay, America's a sick country. That this idea that racism and segregation are a disease that impacts society is one that's pretty pervasive in the civil rights movement. It's called a disease a lot. America's called sick and ill a lot. And so it's interesting to hear him talk about it in those terms. So just before I move on, I just want to, just because I know that there are a couple of teachers here, so if you would like to use something like this in your classroom, kids, all right, so we've got, I just want to show it to you for a second. So here you have different tags. So if you click on ethnic and racial identity, you'll get a lot of what I've shown you here today. Race relations, but there's also a ton of other stuff. So if you have any questions about that, just ask me afterwards, and I'll make sure you have the website and any other materials that you might need. So that's there for you. That's there for them, free to use, and I think that's a really important part. It's free. So if you want to purchase anything, obviously to use, if one of you is writing a book, that's a little different. But for students, you're in your classroom. There's no need to access, a paywall or anything like that. So anyway, so the desegregation of the military, That happens in 1948. Pressure from activists like A. Philip Randolph only increased during the war and after, so events like his Madison Square Garden talk allowed him to grow a tremendous following among black laborers especially, which gave him a lot more influence in the political sphere than other men might have, although he was repeatedly called a socialist, which, you know, probably not a great thing to be called in 1947. And then he and his colleagues in 47 formed the Committee Against Jim Crow in Military Service and Training, and they're really putting pressure on Washington to end segregation in the military. And so that's when, in July 1948, President Truman issues Executive Order 9981, and that officially desegregates the armed forces in the United States. That also expands the fair employment in Executive Order 8802, which disallowed discrimination in employment. So after the order is issued, white supremacist groups are on the rise. So that's something we don't really talk about too much, but after World War II, the KKK gets a bigger following than pretty much ever up to that point. And it had pretty much stagnated during the war. It's not growing, there's other priorities. But by 1946, 47, 48, the KKK has become a pretty large segment of the population. And this isn't just relegated to the South either. There was a headquarters in New York City. So it's something that became even more popular, to put it, I don't know. It's something we don't really think about too often. And it explains a lot of how we get from the progress we made in 41 to 45 to all of the anger and frustration in 1954, all the way up through 1968 and beyond. So this is a huge step. The desegregation, it obviously doesn't completely cure the military of any kind of racist hierarchy, but it's a big step in the right direction. Schools, it's a little more complicated, as was the segregation itself. So schools are not obviously desegregated until 1954, but this also results in a number of other issues. So forced busing and things like that in order to integrate the schools. And just quickly, segregation and integration are different because desegregating doesn't mean the same thing as integration. So a lot of what integration involves is making students of different colors go to schools in order to fulfill that, the kinds of quota of how many students you need to have of each color. So there were students who were traveling up to 2 hours a day on a bus to go to a different neighborhood because they needed to integrate the school. So this happened a lot, especially in urban places like New York City and Boston. Atlanta was one. So you have kids who are spending 4 hours a day just traveling back and forth to school. And you know, what happens when a kid is exhausted? They start falling asleep in school, they're not doing as well. So then there's this shock that students aren't doing as well, and they can't figure out why, because they've desegregated, they've integrated the schools, so what's the problem? And it goes back to that whole you can't be taught by someone who despises you. So a lot of black children, when they end up in their new schools, they're no longer around the teachers that they already knew, so they've got new teachers. They were often subjected to racist teachers who didn't believe that they should be there. They're in a different neighborhood without any of their friends, and that impacts how well you do in school. And then add on top of that, having to travel to and from school 2 hours each way, an hour each way, they're not going to do as well. But what they found was that a lot of the white students were actually doing better. So there's a number of reasons for this. It could just be as simple as teachers deciding that the white students deserved inflated grades, but they were doing better on testing. They were doing better in a number of different areas. So there's a whole complicated, post-civil rights movement study and things like that of how integration actually impacted black communities. But the short answer is it wasn't as great as everybody thought it would be before it happened. So the goal was never to force kids to go somewhere they didn't want to go or force them into a different neighborhood. It was supposed to be that they get this equal opportunity. So rather than fixing the schools in the black communities and the Hispanic communities, they simply shipped kids somewhere else, closed a lot of the schools, a lot of teachers lost their jobs. So the implementation was really problematic, to put it mildly. So we still deal with the aftermath of a lot of this today. Any of the teachers here can probably tell me a lot more than I can tell you about how these systems work. And so one of the goals in especially talking about this today is to, I'd like, you know, so many students that I've talked to don't really understand where these systems come from. They don't understand what it means to have a racist system. They think the individual has a lot more power than they necessarily do. So for me as an educator, it was always really important for them to understand the links in history, the ways that oppression works, that it's not always this personal choice. And so that's one of the things that I'm really proud of being able to show with these websites and being able to distribute this kind of content, is that it's a lot larger than we each think. It's, you know, an individual can change things, but that doesn't mean that, that everything is your fault if you are denied certain opportunities. So, well, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take those.